All right, hello and welcome. I'm Steve Joyson with Northeast Metro Climate Action. Northeast Metro Climate Action is a volunteer-run community organization with members in White Bear Lake, Vadnais Heights, North Oaks, Shoreview, Matamidi, and Lake Elmo. Our mission is to raise awareness about the climate crisis and clean energy solutions. With events like this, we've been doing events like this for 5 years. We kept it going through COVID. On Zoom, and we're doing some in person and some on Zoom now, whatever's more convenient. And we also get involved in community events, and we support climate champion candidates. We're happy to say all 5 of the candidates we endorsed for yesterday's election all won. So we were happy about that. Mounds View School District and White Bear City Council members. So that was I think we have a lot of political clout in this group. We've been batting pretty well with our endorsed candidates over the years. So maybe we just have good candidates that pick from. And we also reach out to elected leaders and make our voices heard at the state and local level within our individual communities, with our state government. So we get involved in a number of areas. Tonight's co-hosts are Resilient Roseville, West Metro Climate Action, Vote Climate, and Sustainable Stillwater. A couple of housekeeping issues. Please, again, keep your microphones on mute. If you have questions for Priscilla during the presentation, you can put those in the chat, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. You got to scroll down there and put it in the chat, and there will be chances during the presentation for Priscilla to address those. So if we're happy to answer questions that you may have. I'd also like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I'd like to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home. For the rest of the year, December, we're not going to have an event. We'll pick up again in January. So keep an eye out for future announcements on January presentation events. Maybe we can get in person on one of those in January. Now I'll introduce this evening's speaker. Priscilla Villa-Watt is an environmental justice advocate who's worked with communities in Texas and Latin America. These communities were impacted by the oil and gas industries. Priscilla also worked on zero waste advocacy in Minnesota and currently focuses her efforts on relationship building and community engagement in statewide environmental decisions with the Environmental Quality Board. Priscilla, if you'd like to go ahead.
I will take it away. Hi, everyone, and so happy to be here. Yes, my name is Priscilla, and it's been a while since I've spoken about these issues, so I'm really excited to be here tonight. Thankfully, my 10-month-old is cooperating and is hanging out with my husband and not clinging to me right now. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me 1 second while I pull that up. Okay. All right. And can I get a verbal yes to make sure that everyone can see this okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So, fracking for plastics, how communities in Texas and Minnesota are impacted and fighting back is what I'm going to be talking about today. A little bit about me. As was mentioned earlier, I've been working on environmental and racial justice issues for a little over 7 years. I'm born and raised in Texas, but moved to Minnesota in 2019. And I'm one of the featured activists in the story of plastic. I have an academic background in applied anthropology, and the way I got into doing this work is a really interesting story that will be relevant in the presentation I'm sharing. I worked in the oil and gas industry for 2 years after I graduated from college, and I was doing accounting work at an environmental quote unquote, firm. And at the time, I didn't know what fracking was. And so I was assuming that I was working for an environmentally friendly, firm. And it turned out that we were actually the ones who were submitting air permits for frack sites to the state. So one day I get a phone call. Again, I'm in the accounting department. I get a phone call accidentally transferred to my line. And it's this woman who's really concerned about her son who's getting this really terrible skin reaction to the water. And her pediatrician had mentioned that the kind of skin lesions he was having would potentially be related to the chemicals, certain chemicals that are found um, in fracking during fracking, and so they were worried that their water would be contaminated. So I went and talked to another engineer, and I told her what was going on, and she's like, "Oh yeah, that happens all the time. We get those calls all the time." So I'm horrified. I'm like, "This is the norm." So I go to grad school, and I decided to do my thesis on understanding the health impacts that are coming from um, fracking, and how people living near these frack sites were impacted. So that's kind of how I got into all of this work. And yeah, it's pretty terrible, but also glad that I ended up doing this. So with that, here's a little outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll give a brief overview of what fracking is. I'll talk about where plastics come from and how they're related, investments in plastics, environmental justice and health, the impacts of waste in Minnesota, and then solutions and how you can help. So what is fracking? So traditional oil and gas extraction was just a vertical drill, the way you like drill a hole into just about anything. It was just going straight down. With hydraulic fracturing or fracking, the difference is that they're now send a drill that goes horizontally into a very deep layer of rock called shale. And why they do this is because there are larger pockets of oil and gas in this layer of rock. And so what they do is they send in water, silica sand, which comes from Minnesota, by the way, and chemicals that get injected into that layer of rock. It cracks the rock, and then it allows the gas and oil to flow back out. As you can see here in this image, there's a water table that these pipes have to go through. And oftentimes there are cracks and leaks. And so that's how you get those chemicals into the water, and issues like the one that I talked about earlier with this woman and her son. And then so there's the pollution that happens in the ground level, and then at the surface level, which you have are a lot of those chemicals emitting out into the open air. So here is what an actual frack site looks like. We don't have fracking in Minnesota. We do have, refineries and pipelines, but this is what a frack site looks like. It's about the size of a baseball field. It is extremely loud and very bright. So the communities that I worked with in Texas often complained about insomnia and sleeping issues because these facilities were just so loud, and there were so many of them. And unfortunately, in Texas, there weren't regulations in terms of how far these could be from a home. Just to give you an idea, the blue shaded areas are where you find a lot of that shale rock that has these oil and gas formations. So that's where you usually find fracking, is in those blue areas. So I'm just going to pause there and see if anyone has questions about how fracking works before I go on to this next section. And just FYI, I can't see the chat, so if
Okay, yeah, there's no questions in the chat.
Okay, then I will continue on. So where do plastics come from? Well, 99% of plastics come from fossil fuels. Why is this important? Okay, so first off, how you have this sort of phase one, which was what I call it. So that's the fracked gas, right? And there's a difference between dry gas and wet gas. So dry gas is your typical methane, mostly methane gas. And then you have wet gas, which contains a little bit of methane, but it also has liquids such as ethane, propane, and butane. And so ethane is the key element here that we want to focus on, because ethane is basically the building block for all plastics. So ethane gets what's called cracked into polyethylene at an ethane cracker. So this little chart kind of shows you the pathways. So you have the natural gas coming from frac sites, ethane extracted. It goes to these crackers, and not like a cracker and cheese. These are like monstrous facilities that are really polluting that are terrible for the environment. Remind me when I'm done with this to show you some polluted plastics that I got from one of the sites I was at in Texas. Anyway, and then so the cracker sends the cracked ethane or the polyethylene to other facilities that basically turn it into the list of things that you see here. So everything from diapers, food packaging, cups, styrofoam, vinyl, car parts, paint, basically everything and anything under the sun that's coming from plastic. Any questions about that piece?
Yeah, I have a quick question. We hear that and oil is the basis for plastics. Have most of North America uh, converted to natural gas to make plastics, or are they using, like crude oil?
So before before it's always been ethane. I think the way that we talked about it was just sort of like oil or oil and gas. But just being very specific that it's actually gas or ethane really that's turning into petrochemicals. There is some oil byproducts that are used for like rubber, but the majority of plastics do come from natural gas.
Right, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, hearing none. Investments in plastics. So in this chart, I just really wanted to emphasize how much more wet gas that we've seen produced in the last like 20 years. And a lot of this is basically because of fracking. We frack more and we just have more of this byproduct. And so I really want to emphasize that we are not demanding more plastics. We just have more of this raw material that makes plastics. So naturally, big oil is trying to invest in infrastructure to make a profit out of that byproduct. And there's something like $164 billion infrastructure investments that are going towards these ethane crackers that I mentioned earlier. And I think there is an estimated 33% increase in capacity to make plastics by 2050. And so really what they're doing is they're trying to invest in this product to get us and other parts of the world essentially hooked on plastics as if we're not already. And so this little graphic here on the right shows how much global oil or really gas consumption is being used to produce plastics. So there's just so many investments in this, and there's going to be a huge profit for these companies if these projects come into fruition. And just to give you an idea, I was working with a community in South Texas who was working really hard to fight this petrochemical plant in South Texas. It was one of the biggest ethane crackers in the country. And one important note here is that a lot of these ethane crackers are based in either the Gulf Coast or on the East Coast. And part of the reason is that they want to essentially um, export these raw plastic, these polyethylene, they're called pellets, to other parts of the world so that other people can basically make plastic and plastic materials. Unfortunately, the community that was fighting this particular cracker did not win this fight. And so this facility, I think, is already being built as we speak. And just pausing here for any questions.
No questions in the chat right now.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Oh,
I'm wondering if big oil and gas companies are essentially pivoting toward plastics because of the growing number of EVs, or were they already investing in plastics simultaneously with gasoline, gas?
this is an excellent question. Basically, oil companies are seeing the writing on the wall that there are a lot of efforts to move away from fossil fuels, everything from, cars, electricity. And so they were seeing that the writing on the wall is basically that they're going to lose profits in the coming years because of these transitions, because of climate change. And so they saw this as an opportunity to sort of fill those margins basically by investing in plastics and looking to profit from those materials instead. So yes, there's definitely a relationship there as to why they're investing in plastics manufacturing.
We do have one more question from Lori. Can you explain a little bit more about dry versus wet gas? Do they both come from the same fracking sites?
Yes. So trying to think of a good analogy for this. There are some shale formations that have more wet gas, and there are some that have more dry gas. And it just depends on location. But ultimately, most shale formation does have both wet and dry gas. And so there's no real way to get just like, you can't just go frack just for oil. You can't frack just for wet gas. If you're going to frack, you're just going to get everything that comes out like this. That you can't unscramble the egg, I think is the saying. And so that's kind of just what you get. You get this scrambled egg. And so what they do, and I'll show you in one of the slides, is what they do is separate out all those different materials, or they just burn them. Like sometimes with the wet gas, if there isn't the infrastructure, like a cracker or something nearby to process those chemicals, then they just end up burning them. So part of the sort of jumping ahead here, but part of the argument for investing in this infrastructure to make plastics is that they won't burn it and send it out into the environment. They'll capture it and then make plastics with it. It's a terrible excuse, but that's sort of been their argument for a while. Is that clear, or is there another question, or do I need to elaborate more on that one?
That sounds good.
Okay. So moving on to environmental justice in health. As I mentioned before, with extraction and transportation, or really pipelines, a lot of what the concerns are around ingesting and inhalation. So whether those chemicals are getting into the water, the soil, or are going into the air, they're affecting people in a very real way. The community that I worked with, some people had chronic upper respiratory issues. Some people had chronic migraines and headaches. Some folks had liver issues, kidney issues. So really, there's so many chemicals that are in the air that people are being exposed to that it is almost impossible to live near these facilities and not experience some sort of health issue. And it was really interesting to me, too, to be working with this community because fracking had been relatively new in the last 10 years, and people had been living there most of their lives and had never had any of these health issues until they started to frack in the community. And so it was just really eye-opening how you could see that clearly, how that really shifted for people when fracking started. And also when you look at all the kinds of chemicals that are being emitted into the water and air, what the health issues that those chemicals cause were exactly what people were reporting they were experiencing. And then similarly with refining and manufacturing, it's like a lot of the same kinds of health issues, because a lot of those materials are being emitted, or sorry, chemicals are being emitted into the air and water. And also there's a skin component. So kind of what I talked about earlier too, with the kid and his rash. So all kinds of issues. There's also a report about women who are pregnant and who experience like low birth weight or labor issues when they are living near these facilities because of those chemicals that they're breathing and ingesting. So this is, if you watch the story of plastic, you may have seen this flare in real time. This was taken in the community that I worked with, and I think you can see a couple of the houses in the background. But as I was mentioning earlier, this is what a frack site, not entirely, but this is what it looks like once they're done fracking. They will put a pump jack somewhere on the property, and then they'll put the smokestack also on that same patch of land. And what this is doing is there's pipelines going underneath that's transporting the oil and the dry gas, and the wet gas is being, whatever isn't being captured is being burned in this way. And this is totally legal in Texas, unfortunately. And so basically those emissions are just getting burned out into the air, including ethane, unless it's being captured. And one of the nonprofits that I worked with also worked with communities to try and document concerns that they were having. So unfortunately, some of these chemicals are invisible. So benzene is one of them, and it is a cancer-causing chemical, as we know. And so you can't see these, but you can definitely smell them. And I can tell you, when I was out in these communities, I could smell rotten eggs, which is one of the chemical smells. And you can't see them, but this photo on the left was taken when we were using what's called an infrared camera on the right, so that you could actually see the emissions coming from this facility. This photo was taken from someone's backyard, so very close to people's homes, and of course, there's direct impacts that communities face. And oftentimes, these communities are either low income or communities of color. And here in Houston, when I was there, there's like a 16-mile stretch of refineries and petrochemical facilities. So you can kind of see Houston, the skyline there in the background. And then all of this is just refineries and petrochemical sites. And it's a huge environmental justice issue because a lot of the communities here are brown and black and low income. So people can't or don't have the resources to basically live elsewhere. Houston is a very expensive place to live. And so what ends up happening is that the areas that are more affordable are near places like these. And just as an FYI, Texas and Louisiana are one of the 4 major regions around the world that produce plastics. And again, that goes back to that point about fracking, like where those where the shale formations are and where fracking is happening. This happened while I was living in Houston. So that top photo was taken from my balcony, and I lived in the inner city. So I lived about 25 miles from the refinery zone. And there's an explosion at one of the facilities that prompted a shelter in place for 34,000 people. And that's a huge concern because as these chemicals are being burned into the air, people are just being asked to stay home, close windows, cover vents. So you can imagine how terrifying that can be for someone especially people who have kids. And I think it was reported that this particular fire traveled all the way to Austin, Texas. So air monitors there were picking up chemicals that were burning in Houston. And I will just pause there again to see if there's any questions.
We do have a couple of questions. The first one from Diane asks about the burning in the at the wells is on purpose. So they just want to get rid of the product that they don't want. Is that your understanding of that?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and I'll follow.
Oh,
I
sorry.
have
Go
one
ahead.
question.
Mhm.
I don't know, Priscilla, if you had seen the news tonight, there was a chemical explosion in Shepherd, Texas, which sounded like it was close to Houston. That there is a big explosion that the county that it occurred in, they say, oh, we're not sure if what's burning is toxic or not. The county next door said, yes, we know it's toxic. You know, it's like, oh my God.
Oh, it's terrible. And I have not seen the news, but it's got to be somewhere in that region of Texas. They're just chemical and petrochemical and plastic facilities all over, and a lot of those chemicals are flammable. There's fires all the time. Fortunately, a lot of those fires aren't as drastic as the one that I showed. But even if they're not as drastic, if there's a community living nearby, they're definitely going to be impacted by it. And unfortunately, the state doesn't require these companies to disclose what is being burnt. And so they basically are allowed to just share what they think they need to share. The only way that people know what they're breathing is by finding out through like the air monitors. If they pick up, whatever is burning, they'll find out that way. Yeah, it's very controversial because so many people work in this industry, and it's so hard to do anything sort of politically because of that. So, yeah, it's terrible.
So
the company, I took a quick look at it, called Sound Resource Solutions. And when I looked at them, they had on their website, they say products. And when you look at that, everything that they're producing appears to be terrible. Like the first one I saw was toluene, and it's just one thing after another that looked like it would burn very readily. And it's just amazing.
Yep.
And bad.
Yeah. I just looked it up, and they make solvents for glue and paint remover. And actually, the fire that I showed on the screen earlier, the tank that blew up was holding, I think, what is it called? Accutane. It's the stuff that's in acetone, the stuff that's in like nail polish remover. That's what blew up that one photo.
So I'm just going to follow up here on the burning, and it's important to understand that the reason they burn it is that when they burn it, it converts it to carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. And it's not a perfect conversion. Some ethane, methane, and other hydrocarbon gases also escape through that. But the vast majority of it gets turned to carbon dioxide. That's the primary product of combustion of any of those hydrocarbons, which, as we know, carbon dioxide, we don't want it in the atmosphere, but it's a far less potent greenhouse gas than the methane, ethane that they're burning. So it's actually, if you see it flaring, yes, it's bad that they're burning these things, but it's better than just letting them gas out. So yeah, and that's one of the things I think Biden is going to do with the Civilian Climate Corps, is go around and cap all these wells that are not used. I don't know if I'm stealing your thunder here, Priscilla, but that's a big project. Lori, why don't you unmute and go ahead and ask your questions?
Oh, actually, one quick note about what you just said too is that yes, burning is is not ideal, but it is better than just letting it out, letting it out into the atmosphere. But oftentimes they are just releasing those chemicals and not burning them. That's the, let's see, the photo I showed, this photo,
Yeah, venting.
that is not lit. That is just being
Yeah.
released into the air. And more often than not, we would go to these facilities and we would see these kinds of emissions coming from them, and there was no flame. Okay, sorry, someone else had a question?
Yeah, I had a couple questions, Priscilla. Is there more information available about the chemicals that are used injecting? I know that businesses have been able to shield that information, and PFAS was one of the chemicals being used, but is there more information on that? Do you know?
You know, there might be. I mean, there's so many organizations that have been doing research on this. I mean, the oil companies are basically saying that their recipes are proprietary, and so that's why we don't have a complete list. But I think through research over the years, there have been able to find out what those chemicals are. I would look at the what is it, EIA. I forget what it stands for, but there might be some information on the EIA. I'll have to think about where else you could find that. Yeah.
Cool. And then my other question is, I think the EPA has a new mandate that they should be looking at frontline communities and the pollution they're experiencing. Do you know if that is having an impact or if they're actually doing that?
I don't know where that's at currently.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just wondering.
No more questions at this point.
Okay. So this next section is the impacts of waste in Minnesota. So we talked about, it's kind of the narrative here is like, we got fracking, we've got plastics, we've got investments in plastics. And so where does Minnesota lie in all this? We're obviously not producing plastics here, and we're not fracking here. So how does Minnesota play into this role of waste? So why waste matters. Reducing, reusing, or recycling waste basically reduces greenhouse gas emissions because landfilling increases them. So landfilling is not what we want to be doing with our trash. I think Minnesota saved about 4.25 million metric tons of carbon dioxide because of waste management practices. So just to give you an idea, that's about 902,000 passenger vehicles. And I think this is a really important note here, because when I first moved here, there was some debate about whether or not we should be building out more landfills and what to do with the trash. And so I think it's just really important to note how much trash we're dealing with in Minnesota, and that a lot of that trash are plastics. Okay, so if we're not landfilling it, what else are we doing with it? Well, burning it is also not the answer. There is a local organization called the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table that has worked very hard for years to try and shut down the HERC, which is a trash incinerator in like downtown Minneapolis. And so there are all kinds of similar health concerns around waste incinerators. There's the acronyms are really really bad with today, but Gaia, the Global Alliance Against Incineration, has tons of information about this and why it matters and what they're doing about it. But I think the important thing here is that with the HERC, what 70% of what's going into it can be either recycled or composted. So that leads me into this section about what it is that you can do and what solutions can we work towards to help minimize waste and minimize plastics production. So recycling, as I mentioned in this last slide, is one of those solutions. And took this quote because it really stuck with me. We are not in a recycling crisis, we're in a packaging crisis. And so I think there's always been this sort of story around plastics that we just need to like recycle it right, or or yeah, and so I think there's just an issue with that. And while recycling is a short-term solution, it's definitely not a long-term one. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize around recycling is that a lot of packaging currently isn't being captured in the way that we currently recycle. And so one effort that's really aimed at solving this problem is what's called the a bottle bill, which is an effort that creates a system to have like bottle return systems, so that plastic bottles are being captured and reused. And so just to give you an example of how this is working in other states, this can increase a container recycling rate by 60%, whereas like non-deposit states or non-bottle bill states only reach about 24%. So that's just one way of getting those bottles out of the trash and out of it, like these incinerators, and really helping capture them and recycle them. Another effort that I really wanted to highlight here is something called the extended producer responsibility effort. And this is a way of solving the plastics problem by transitioning towards a more circular economy. And so what this does essentially is it puts the onus of waste, particularly plastics waste, on the people who are putting it on our shelves and putting it in our homes. And so those are those companies. These are like the companies that are making their products, selling their products in plastics. And so the idea is that they would be forced to redesign what their products are sold in so that they're easier to either compost or recycle or be reused. And so their responsibility would be that entire process. So as a consumer, we would only be consuming and dealing with the product that we want versus the packaging that it comes in. I think that's probably the easiest way to like communicate this. But like when we buy, like just about anything, headphones, they come in like in plastic packaging, but we're not paying. We don't want the plastic. We just want the item. And so this really puts the responsibility back onto those people who are giving us that product and saying, hey, figure out how to deal with your trash, instead of putting it on the consumer. And then I also wanted to just mention some zero waste and right to repair efforts in Minnesota. So there is a bill called House File 2693, which is for zero waste grants. And what this does is it provides funding to schools and organizations to basically, businesses to create more zero waste efforts. And so an example would be a restaurant who has like single-use plastic cutlery at their restaurant, and they would be able to apply for a grant and purchase something like a dishwasher, a commercial dishwasher, so they could have like plates and reusable things that they would just wash. So I think that's an important effort that's going on currently. And then I believe last year, the governor signed the right to repair law, which allows, it's pretty straightforward, but it basically allows owners or handy people to be able to fix their own equipment without having to trash it. So things like phones, laptops, appliances, and whatnot. And also forces companies to provide instructions or parts that can be used to repair items instead of them just going to a landfill or being burned. And with that, I'm just going to leave this here for a bit. These are some organizations and efforts that are currently going on in Minnesota. So Eureka Recycling is a local nonprofit recycler who does zero waste advocacy. The Minnesota Environmental Justice Table has really great information about how you can help stop the incinerator in Minneapolis. Of course, the Sierra Club North Star chapter, stopping Line 3, any pipeline basically right now is terrible for our people, the land, and the environment. And just another way to really cut off our dependence on fossil fuels. And then the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers is a national group of nonprofit recyclers who are also focusing on like zero waste and waste reduction practices. And then lastly, the Break Free from Plastics movement is a great place to find all kinds of resources, information, campaign ideas on how we can move away from plastics. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I will be able to see everyone again.
All right, that was great. Hey, I have a question about, the oil companies trying to expand their plastics. You showed the oil drums going from 6% to 20% or something like that. The U.S., hopefully we're kind of mindful of that and trying to reduce our plastics. Do you know if the oil companies are really focusing on developing countries to try to make incursions into those countries to try to sell more plastic? Or do you know how they're trying to market more plastics?
Yep, that's exactly right. So their idea is that they would invest in the infrastructure to make the plastics, like here in the US, in Europe, like first world countries, and then they're exporting those materials to smaller countries that just don't have as much reliance on plastics currently. And so that, yeah, that's definitely the evil plan.
The Nestle strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me just pull out. Okay, so the ethane cracker that I mentioned earlier, there was one in a different part of South Texas that had been running forever. And so I was out there with some advocates once, and they were doing a plastic pellet collection. So these little beads in this Ziploc bag are what come from the cracker plants. So those little beads, I mean, they're hard. They're like beads, and they're tiny. And so they get into water systems. These were just found on the shore, and this bag contains 1,845 of them that were picked up in a minute. And so there's millions and billions of these in the water. And so these beads essentially are what get shipped to, like, all these big companies that make plastics, and they just melt the beads and shape them into whatever they want. And that's how you get, your nice Coke bottles.
Any other questions for Priscilla?
Yeah, I had a question about your work in Latin America. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are they facing the same kind of fracking, plastic production stuff that we have here?
Yep. So what we did with our partners in Latin America was we would take that infrared camera that showed those invisible emissions and work with communities to basically see what was coming out of some of the oil and gas sites down there, and then try and help them also advocate for changes at the state or federal level. So it's different in different Latin American countries. Like Mexico has been doing oil production for as long as we have, basically. Not as much fracking, but some, and mostly American companies that are going down there to frack. But then, like with Argentina, they were doing some fracking there, but not as much. And so we were working with indigenous communities who were really fighting back against that, because fracking is so water intensive that it was using up a very valuable resource in a community that just didn't have that much to begin with. So that was the fight there. And then in Colombia, the fight was really to stop or prevent fracking, which they won, by the way. They banned fracking in Colombia, so that was a huge win.
Have you worked with the groups that are doing the monitoring of methane leakage at fracking sites? I think it's university led, and they've got these methane detectors, and they're flying over low plains, and they're detecting the amount of methane that's leaking out. And it's always, always, always way more than is being reported by the fracking companies. Have you done any work with that?
No, I haven't, but I heard of this before I left Texas. And so I think that was just starting to get underway. It's tricky because in Texas, it's like it's considered private property. So you can't just be flying around on top of sites. I don't know. There's some legal issues there, but I don't know how that was working out. But yeah, I had heard about that, which is pretty cool and scary.
So I have a question. Going back to that little boy with the rash, is anyone or any entity trying to help these people? I mean, I'd want to go all Aaron Brockovich on that kind of facility.
So the tricky part is there's no real way to pinpoint where it's coming from because there's just so many. This is the county that I think had the most frac sites in the entire state. And so there's no real way to point fingers at who's doing it, where it's coming from. So that's one part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that an issue I came up against is that people were very afraid to speak up out against these oil companies because their neighbors, their friends, their family, or in some way, shape, or form benefiting from the industry. So if someone owned a restaurant that was doing really well because there were so many workers coming into town to work on the frac sites, it's a lucrative business, and unfortunately, it's just permeated into every aspect of life in Texas as in the entire state. And so it was really difficult to speak out against it in that way. And so what we were trying to do was just say, like, can the state just monitor the air better? Because the way the way Texas monitors air is based on population density, and this county wasn't densely populated, but it did have tons of industrial development, and they just weren't monitoring air there the way they should be, the way they would be in like a city like Houston. So that was one of the fights we were picking at the time. But it was really hard to get people to just say, like, yeah, fracking is terrible and we want it gone, because their heads would get bitten off by a brother, a sister, a neighbor, a loved one. So it's a really challenging issue in Texas, unfortunately.
All right, any more questions for Priscilla? All right, well, thank you, Priscilla. That was really very interesting. Great work on that. And, good luck with your work on the EQB. I'm also in a group called Resilient Cities and Communities, and we're hoping to work with the EQB in a number of ways there as well. So that's a great organization, and happy to hear that you're part of it.
Great, thank you. I will likely send a follow-up with like links, resources, and information for folks to check out if they're interested. But if you can send that to people, that I could definitely do that.
Perfect. All right, thanks again, and we'll see everybody again in January after the holidays. All right, thanks.
Great, thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.